A young black mother stands frozen at the checkout, her children crying her money not enough. Before she can speak, an elderly man steps forward and quietly pays for everything. She thinks it ends there, but 5 days later, a phone call changes both their lives forever. This is a story of elderly kindness. Watch until the end and tell us how it made you feel. It was early, just after 6 in the morning, when Maximus Saunders stepped through the sliding glass doors of Brightmart, a neighborhood grocery store tucked in the quieter part of Oak Ridge, a small southern town where most people still knew each other's names, and the days moved slower than the rest of the world. Maximus had been shopping at that same store at that same hour for years. The lights overhead were still a bit too bright, the floors too shiny, and the air a little too cold, but he didn't mind. At that hour, there were no crowds, no lines, no noise. It suited him just fine. The aisles were mostly empty except for a few early risers like himself, older folks, some stock clerks restocking shelves, and a manager sipping coffee at the front desk. Maximus preferred it this way, quiet, controlled, familiar. He walked slowly, his steps deliberate, taking his time near the produce section where he always lingered. There was a kind of comfort in the routine of it all, examining apples, checking for bruises, picking out exactly 4 bananas. Anna used to insist on green-tipped ones. She had been gone for nearly 7 years now, but he still remembered. His fingers paused over a carton of strawberries, and for a moment he considered buying them, though he knew he wouldn't eat them alone. He didn't do sweet much anymore. Just as he reached for a bag of oranges, the quiet rhythm of the store was broken by the sharp, piercing sound of a child's cry. It wasn't the casual whine of a child denied a treat. This was something deeper, raw, hungry, exhausted. He turned his head instinctively, and that was when he saw them. A woman maybe in her early 30s stood near the entrance, pushing a shopping cart with one hand and cradling a small girl in the other arm. The child, no older than 3, clung to her neck, her hair tangled, and her little face pressed into her mother's shoulder, muffling a whimper. A boy around 6 tugged at the woman's coat, his eyes red and his voice cracking as he pleaded for cereal. She looked tired, truly bone-deep tired, not just in her eyes, but in the way she moved, like each step cost her something. Her clothes were clean, but worn, her shoes scuffed. And yet, despite everything, she was composed, fragile, but holding herself upright, like she didn't have the luxury of falling apart. Maximus didn't know her, but there was something about the way she moved through that space, the way she tried to hush the children without raising her voice, that pulled at him. She guided the cart toward the produce aisle just a few feet away from him and began sorting through bruised potatoes with one hand while the other held her daughter. The boy trailed behind her silently, now rubbing at his nose with a sleeve. The woman glanced around, her eyes scanning the shelves and the price tags, calculating not just what she needed, but what she could afford to leave behind. The air had shifted. Maximus wasn't the only one watching. A security guard standing by the front door, a younger man, clean-cut, arms crossed, narrowed his eyes at the woman. He didn't say a word, but the look on his face said enough. Suspicion. Discomfort, like her mere presence had set off an alarm. Maximus noticed it immediately, and it bothered him more than he expected. The woman hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't even raised her voice. But she was black. She had 2 children clinging to her. She looked stressed. And for some reason, in that store on that morning, that was enough for someone to assume she didn't belong. Maximus had seen that look before. He had seen it too many times in other people's eyes, never his own. Or so he thought. He didn't like the way it made his chest tighten, or how it suddenly made him ashamed of doing nothing more than watching. He adjusted the strap of his grocery basket and glanced back at the woman. She pulled a few apples from a bin, checked the price, and gently put 2 back. When she noticed him looking, their eyes met for a second. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. There was no hostility, just fatigue, and something else. Maybe resignation. He turned away, giving her space, but her image stayed with him as he moved through the next aisle. He could hear her children's voices echo faintly down the corridor, their words too soft to catch, but charged with emotion. He tried to focus on his list. Eggs, bread, canned soup. But something in him had shifted. He thought about Anna, about how she used to talk to the kids in her classroom with that same calm firmness, about how angry she would have been to see that guard watching the woman like a thief just for being there. By the time Maximus reached the dairy section, he had nearly convinced himself to forget the whole thing. It wasn't his business. The world was hard enough without carrying someone else's burden. But as he turned the corner, he saw the woman again, this time at the checkout counter. She was unloading her groceries, her movements quick and nervous. The boy was standing beside her, hands tucked into his coat sleeves. The little girl was in the cart seat, now her face pressed against the handlebar. The cashier greeted her flatly. No smile, just a perfunctory scan and silence. Maximus stood behind them at a distance, pretending to browse the magazines. He watched as the total climbed on the screen. $52, then $58, then $64. He saw the woman reach into her coat pocket, pull out a small bundle of bills, worn, folded, and carefully counted. Her fingers moved over them once, then again, slower. She frowned. He could see it even from where he stood. She didn't have enough. She hesitated, eyes darting between the total and her cart. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "I'll have to put a few things back," she said, starting to reach toward the bread and the frozen chicken. The cashier didn't respond, just paused, waiting. The line behind her started to grow. Maximus didn't think. He didn't weigh the pros and cons or consider how it might be received. He just stepped forward, placing one hand lightly on the woman's shoulder and the other on the edge of the counter. "No need for that," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "Let me take care of it." The woman turned toward him, eyes wide. She looked stunned, unsure. For a moment she opened her mouth to object, but no words came. The boy looked up at Maximus, then at his mother. The cashier waited, uninterested. "I can't let you do that," the woman finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Maximus smiled, not the kind of smile that asked for anything in return, but one that simply reassured. "Yes, you can," he replied. "We all have hard days." He took out his wallet and handed a few bills to the cashier without another word. The transaction moved quickly after that. The woman didn't cry, though her eyes glistened as she mouthed a quiet thank you. Maximus gave her a small nod, then stepped back to let her gather her things. Daisy stood still in the checkout lane for a moment longer than she needed to, almost like her body hadn't quite caught up with what had just happened. Her hands hovered uncertainly over the brown paper bags the cashier had pushed across the counter. Maximus had already stepped aside, quietly folding his wallet and tucking it back into his coat, making no show of his gesture. He didn't wait for her thanks or expect anything in return. He was about to turn and leave when he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, slightly faded business card. His fingers hesitated just briefly before he placed it gently next to the last bag of groceries. "In case you ever need anything else," he said, looking at her but not pressing. "No pressure." His voice was calm, neither overly kind nor detached, just honest. Then he gave her a polite nod and walked away without another word. Daisy stared at the card for a second, unsure if she should take it. It wasn't fancy plain white with a simple serif font. Maximus Saunders, Oak Ridge retired educator, followed by a home phone number. Nothing more. She slid it into her coat pocket, not sure why she was keeping it, only knowing that the morning had taken a turn she hadn't expected. Outside the store, the wind had picked up. Maximus loaded his groceries into the back of his car methodically, one bag at a time. He kept thinking about the kids, the little girl with her sleepy eyes, and the boy who looked too serious for his age. He thought about the way Daisy's shoulders tensed every time someone looked at her too long, or how she never let go of the cart handle, like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The world could be harsh, and for some people, it never seemed to let up. As he slid into the driver's seat, he sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield. He wasn't in a rush to get home. The drive back was short, but his mind stayed busy. Oak Ridge wasn't a big town, but it had layers. Some folks lived in brightly painted houses with porch swings and tended flower beds. Others, well, they lived where the sidewalks broke and the bus didn't run. Maximus had spent years teaching in public schools, seeing both sides of town, hearing the stories kids brought with them in their backpacks and their eyes. He had never liked how uneven it all was, but after Anna passed, he'd retreated inward. He'd kept to himself, kept quiet, kept safe. That morning, something had shifted, though he couldn't quite name what. Back at home, Maximus carried his groceries inside, setting each bag on the kitchen counter with a neatness that had once amused his wife. He put everything away, slowly wiped down the table, then filled the kettle. The radio was off. The television was off. Even the old grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to tick more loudly than usual. He sat down with a cup of tea and stared at the garden outside, overgrown in parts where Anna used to trim. The wind rustled through the leaves, but the stillness inside the house pressed in close. He reached into his pocket, pulled out another of his cards, and set it on the table. He hadn't given one of those out in years. On the other side of town, Daisy sat behind the steering wheel of a rusted-out sedan parked in a nearly empty lot behind an abandoned pharmacy. It wasn't where she wanted to be, but it was quiet and off the main road. She'd found it the night before after being asked to leave the gas station across town. She had tried to explain she just needed a safe place to rest, but the clerk had looked at her with that same look. She was used to suspicious dismissive. He didn't ask questions, but he didn't hide the disapproval in his eyes either. Maple was asleep in the back seat, curled into a ball under a jacket that barely fit. Connor sat beside her, flipping slowly through a book he'd already read twice. Daisy had tried to make a game out of reading in the car, calling it camping, but even he was starting to see through it. The food from Brightmart sat in 2 bags on the passenger seat, untouched for now. She hadn't eaten herself since the night before. She kept checking the rearview mirror, her eyes scanning for anyone who might knock on her window or tell her to move along. The fear wasn't dramatic or loud. It was constant quiet, gnawing, the kind that settles into your bones. She pulled out her phone and checked it for the 10th time. No messages, no returned emails, no space in the nearby shelters. Her fingers were stiff from the cold, but she fumbled through the front pouch of her bag looking for something to write on. That was when she felt the corner of the card, the one Maximus had given her. She stared at it for a while, holding it between 2 fingers. She thought about calling. She thought about how she had promised herself she wouldn't rely on anyone again. People could be kind, but kindness always came with an expiration date, or worse, an agenda. Still, something about the way he had spoken, the way he had walked away without expecting a thank you, had stuck with her. Connor looked up from his book, his voice soft. "Mommy, where are we sleeping tonight?" Daisy didn't answer right away. Her eyes were still on the card. She let out a long breath, grabbed her phone, and punched in the number. Maximus was just finishing his second cup of tea when the phone rang. The sound startled him. Few people called him anymore, especially not on the landline. He glanced at the receiver, hesitated, then picked it up. "Maximus Saunders speaking." There was a pause on the other end, then a shaky voice, quiet and uncertain. "Mr. Saunders, this is Daisy, from the store. I'm sorry to call you like this." Maximus straightened in his chair. His heart gave a small jolt, not fear, but alertness. He recognized her voice immediately, despite only hearing it once. "Of course," he said gently. "I remember. Are you and the kids okay?" Another pause. Then came the sigh, the kind that carries more weight than words. "We're not. We're staying in the car. I didn't know who else to call. I know it's not your problem. I found your card, and I guess I thought—" Maximus leaned forward, his knuckles pressing into the table. "I'm glad you called," he said simply. "You did the right thing." He heard her breath catch on the other end like she had been holding back for too long. There was no sobbing, no dramatics, just silence. And then a quiet, barely there voice. "Thank you." He nodded, though she couldn't see it. "You and the kids can come here," he said. "I have space, a warm room. You don't have to sleep in the car again." "Mr. Saunders, I don't want to be a burden. You've already done so much." "You're not a burden," he replied firmly. "You're a mother doing the best you can. Let me do the same." For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Daisy whispered, "Okay." Maximus glanced toward the empty hallway that once led to Anna's room, then looked back out the window at the wind brushing against the flowers they used to plant together. "Come over whenever you're ready," he said. "You're welcome here." And with that, a door opened not just in his house, but in both of their lives. Neither of them knew what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, something felt possible. Not easy, not perfect, but possible. Maximus woke before the sun, the room still wrapped in darkness, though he wasn't sure if it was the restlessness in his body or the weight of the previous night's phone call that pulled him from sleep. He sat up slowly, his joints aching with the familiar stiffness of age, and reached for the sweater draped over the chair near his bed. The house was quiet, as it always was, but this morning the silence didn't feel as comfortable as it usually did. It was the kind of silence that pressed in on him, that made him aware of every tick from the old wall clock and every creak in the hardwood floor beneath his feet. As he moved through the hallway and into the guest bedroom, the one Anna used to use as her sewing room, he turned on the light and stood in the doorway for a moment. The bed was made, though it hadn't been used in years. A few boxes remained stacked in the corner, filled with things he hadn't had the heart to sort through. He spent the next hour quietly clearing space, folding an extra blanket across the end of the bed, setting out a towel, and placing a fresh bar of soap on the edge of the bathroom sink. Before stepping out, he added a small vase of cut flowers from the garden, not because he thought it was necessary, but because it felt right. By the time the sun had crested over the ridge behind the neighborhood, Maximus had already swept the front porch and brewed a second pot of coffee. He moved slower than he used to, but today his pace was steady with purpose. He kept glancing at the driveway, though he didn't expect them until later in the morning. Part of him wondered if they would come at all. He knew better than to expect too much. Trust didn't come easy to people who'd been through what Daisy had. He remembered her voice on the phone, calm but fragile, like someone carefully holding a glass already cracked. Still, he hoped. Not out of charity, but because something in him had stirred that he hadn't felt in years. Just after 9, a battered silver sedan pulled onto the gravel stretch in front of his house. It moved slowly, tires crunching against stone, and came to a stop near the edge of the lawn. Maximus stepped outside and waited, not approaching too quickly, giving them space. The driver's door opened, and Daisy stepped out, her expression cautious but composed. She moved to the back seat and gently lifted Maple into her arms. The little girl's eyes were half closed, her body limp with exhaustion. Connor followed closely behind, clutching a worn backpack. Maximus noticed how the boy's eyes darted across the porch, the windows, then back to him, as if measuring whether this place was truly safe. "You made it," Maximus said, his voice calm and steady. Daisy nodded, once her grip on Maple tightening slightly. "Yeah, we didn't hit too much traffic." It was a nervous deflection, but Maximus didn't call attention to it. He stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in. Take your time," he said. "You're welcome here." Inside, the air was warm. The scent of fresh-baked bread lingered faintly from breakfast. Maximus had thought it might be comforting, a small signal that this wasn't a shelter or a waiting room, but a home. Daisy stepped in carefully, as though the floor might shift under her feet. Connor stayed close, glancing up at the framed photographs on the walls, black and white pictures of a younger Maximus, one of him in front of a classroom, another holding a fishing rod next to a smiling woman. "I made up the guest room," Maximus said, leading them down the hallway. "It's not fancy, but it should be comfortable. You'll have some privacy, and the kids can stretch out a little." Daisy nodded again. "This is more than I expected." Her voice was softer now, a little less guarded. Maximus opened the door to the room. The morning light streamed through half-drawn curtains, catching the edge of the clean white bedding. The flowers on the table added a splash of color to the otherwise simple decor. Connor stepped inside first, then looked back at his mother with wide eyes. "Mom, it's nice," he said, hopping up onto the bed, testing it with a bounce. The mattress creaked but held firm. Maple stirred slightly in Daisy's arms. She looked around, disoriented, then laid her head back on her mother's shoulder. "You can rest," Maximus said quietly. "No one's rushing you." For a while there was only movement, the unpacking of bags, the setting down of shoes, the small but significant acts of claiming space. Daisy didn't say much, but the stiffness in her posture began to ease. Her eyes wandered around the room, settling on the window ledge, the corner chair, the folded blanket. Each small gesture had landed, even if she wasn't ready to say so. Later that afternoon, Maximus made a simple meal, vegetable soup, and buttered toast. The kitchen table was set for 4, and when Daisy brought the children in, Connor climbed into a chair without hesitation. Maple sat on her mother's lap, too sleepy to eat much, but content to pick at pieces of carrot from the bowl. Daisy ate quietly, watching the children more than the food. "They haven't had a real meal in a few days," she said, not looking up. "Well, they're welcome to as many as they need," Maximus replied. He reached across the table and refilled Connor's glass of water. "This house has more than enough." There was no talk of repayment, no awkward insistence, just food warmth and a shared silence that didn't feel as heavy as it had the night before. After dinner, Daisy bathed the kids in the small bathroom down the hall while Maximus cleaned the dishes. He moved methodically, drying each plate with the care of someone who'd lived alone long enough to find peace in routine. When everything was put away, he stepped outside to the back porch. The garden was quiet, the late sunlight casting long shadows across the rows of flower beds that hadn't seen much tending lately. He sat down on the old wooden bench and rubbed his hands together against the chill. A few minutes passed before he heard the screen door creak. Daisy stepped out, her arms crossed over her chest. She hesitated at first, then sat on the other end of the bench. The space between them wasn't large, but it felt meaningful. "This place is peaceful," she said, glancing out toward the garden. "My wife Anna used to say the same thing," Maximus replied. "She planted most of what you see out there. I've tried to keep it going, some days better than others." Daisy nodded, her gaze softening. "She passed 7 years ago," Maximus said. "Cancer. Quick. Quieter than she deserved." "I'm sorry," Daisy said. He looked over at her, his expression unreadable, but not closed. "She would have liked you," he said. Strong women always made her smile. Daisy looked down, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I haven't felt strong in a while." "You got 2 kids asleep under a warm roof," Maximus said. "That's more strength than most people ever learn to show." She didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "I don't know how to thank you for this." "You don't need to," he said. "Just breathe. That's enough." The sky darkened slowly as the garden grew still. For the first time in a long while, both of them sat without a need to fill the silence. They didn't know yet what this new arrangement would mean or how long it would last. But in that moment, under the fading light of day, it was enough to simply share the quiet. The morning began like the one before it, quiet, steady, and filled with simple tasks. Maximus was up early, already dressed and outside by the time the sun made its way past the low rooftops of Oak Ridge. He watered the garden in his usual rhythm, pausing every so often to straighten a bent stem or remove a leaf too far gone to save. Inside, Daisy was in the kitchen, gently heating up oatmeal for the kids, while Maple colored at the table with a pink crayon clutched in her tiny fingers. Connor sat on the porch steps, legs dangling, reading a children's atlas he'd found on Maximus's shelf. There was a calmness to it, all the kind that felt too fragile to last. Daisy moved slower than the day before, but there was less tension in her shoulders. The kids hadn't woken up crying, and for the first time in weeks, she hadn't slept with one eye open. She knew better than to believe things were suddenly safe, but for that moment, it was enough to be still. Maximus noticed her glancing at the front window more often than usual, her eyes flickering toward the gravel driveway, like she was listening for something she couldn't name. When their eyes met, she gave a small, polite smile, the kind you give when you're trying not to think about what's coming. Maximus didn't push her. He believed in giving people room to settle in at their own pace. Still, he couldn't ignore the faint thread of tension that had returned to the air. Around mid-morning, Daisy was washing dishes, her sleeves rolled up, water running gently when she heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Her hands froze, and for a moment, she didn't breathe. Maximus looked up from the garden and saw a dark blue SUV rolling slowly toward the house. It was too polished, too deliberate. Not a neighbor, not a delivery. His chest tightened. He didn't recognize the car, but he didn't need to. The way it pulled up close, right to the edge of the porch, told him this wasn't a casual visit. The engine shut off. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything they'd carried so far. Maximus stood up and walked to the front door. Connor, sensing something, slipped inside and stood near his mother. Daisy dried her hands quickly and picked up Maple without a word, pressing the little girl's head into her shoulder. The front door opened slowly. Maximus stepped onto the porch, his back straight, eyes clear. The man stepping out of the SUV was tall, clean-shaven, and dressed in business casual clothing that tried too hard to look relaxed. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He walked toward Maximus like he owned the ground. He stood on his hands in his coat pockets, his steps measured. "You must be Maximus," the man said, voice smooth with a forced courtesy that felt rehearsed. "I believe you have something of mine." Maximus kept his tone even. "Depends on what you're looking for." The man tilted his head slightly, the corners of his mouth lifting, but it wasn't a smile. "My name is Leo Henderson. I'm looking for my wife and my kids." Maximus didn't respond right away. He studied Leo's face. His posture was too relaxed, his tone too controlled. He was used to getting his way, used to people stepping aside. "I don't believe Daisy is your wife anymore," Maximus said calmly, "and the children are with their mother where they feel safe. That's what matters here." Leo's jaw flexed, a flicker of annoyance passing through his expression before he caught himself. He stepped 1 inch closer to the steps. "You're meddling in something you don't understand. This is a family matter. She took my children and disappeared. That's called kidnapping where I come from." Maximus didn't move. She didn't take them. She left because she had to. There's a difference. Inside the house, Daisy stood behind the curtain near the living room window, holding her breath. When she heard his voice, her knees nearly buckled. Maple stirred in her arms, sensing the tension. Connor reached out and took hold of her hand. "Stay here." Daisy whispered to them. She walked slowly toward the front door, each step heavier than the last. When she stepped out onto the porch, Leo turned and looked at her like he was expecting it. His face shifted. It wasn't surprise. It was satisfaction. "There you are," he said, as if they'd merely lost each other in a grocery store. "Hiding again. Running around with our kids pretending like you're the victim. You're not." Daisy's voice came out quiet but firm. "I'm not pretending anything. You don't scare me anymore." Leo smiled, but there was nothing kind about it. "Don't be dramatic, Daisy. You know I'll win. You don't have the money, the lawyers, or the reputation. You're a single mother with no job living in a stranger's house. I've got witnesses, I've got documents, and I've got patience." Maximus's voice cut in low and steady. "You've said what you came to say. Now leave." Leo looked at him again, this time with narrowed eyes. "You think this is over because she's hiding here. You think I can't touch her in court. Let me tell you something, old man. I don't lose." He pulled a manila envelope from his coat and tossed it onto the porch. "This is a formal notice. I'm suing for full custody. I'll see you both in court." Then he turned, walked back to his car, and drove off without looking back. Maximus waited until the vehicle disappeared down the road before bending down to pick up the envelope. He handed it to Daisy without a word. Her hands trembled as she took it, and she didn't open it right away. She just stared at it like it was made of fire. "I knew he'd come," she said, her voice raw. "I just didn't think it would feel like this." Maximus placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out, whatever it takes." She nodded slowly, still looking at the envelope. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the papers on the porch. Inside, the children had gone quiet. Later that evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Daisy sat at the kitchen table with the envelope finally open beside her. Her eyes were tired red at the corners. Maximus sat across from her, reading through the legal jargon. "He's pushing for emergency custody," he said quietly, "claiming you're unstable, that the kids are in danger." Daisy didn't respond. She just shook her head slowly, pressing her fingers to her temples. "He knows exactly what to say to make me look like the problem." "Well," Maximus said, setting the papers down, "then it's time we show who the real problem is." Daisy looked up, her voice almost breaking. "What if we can't? What if the judge believes him? What if all of this was for nothing?" Maximus didn't look away. "Then we fight harder, because those kids deserve more than fear. And so do you." For a long moment they sat in silence. Then Daisy leaned back in her chair, wiped her eyes, and nodded. "Okay," she whispered, "let's fight." And from that moment forward, everything began to shift. Not because they were no longer afraid, but because they refused to be silent. The envelope sat on the kitchen table for 2 days before Daisy finally unfolded the pages inside. It wasn't that she didn't want to know what it said. She already knew. But reading it made it real, in a way her heart wasn't ready for. The formal language, the case number, the accusation of parental unfitness, all printed in bold black type. Leo wanted full custody, not shared, not visitation, full. She read it once, then again, slower. Each word hit harder than the last. Across from her, Maximus sat still, watching her eyes move from line to line, waiting. They had made an appointment with an attorney the same day Leo showed up, and now, sitting in a cramped office above a hardware store on Main Street, Daisy felt the air around her grow tighter with every word the lawyer said. Linda Sow was sharp-focused and didn't waste time with pleasantries. She had handled dozens of family cases, some nastier than this one, but her brow furrowed as she flipped through the paperwork. "He's not just asking for custody," she said, scanning the second page. "He's pushing for an emergency order, painting you as unstable of flight risk, emotionally volatile. The language is designed to trigger immediate concern from a judge." Daisy sat rigid in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. "It's not true. None of that is true. I believe you," Linda said plainly, without condescension. "But in family court, it's not always about truth. It's about what you can prove." Maximus leaned forward slightly. "What are our options?" Linda looked at him for a moment before replying. "You need documentation, proof of abuse, neglect, manipulation, anything. We can challenge the emergency request, but it'll come down to evidence." The next few days felt like a slow unraveling. Leo's lawyer filed motions rapidly. A subpoena arrived demanding Daisy's medical records. Someone contacted one of her former employers asking about her conduct. A vague article appeared on a local community website with a headline that read, "Oak Ridge Mother Disappears with Children Amid Custody Dispute," featuring a photo of Daisy from 3 years ago. It mentioned no names, but the details were unmistakable. Daisy saw the article late at night, alone in the guest room, scrolling through her phone. Her heart sank as she read the cruel comments below the post. People who knew nothing about her called her unstable, selfish, irresponsible. A few accused her of exploiting the kids. She stared at the screen for a long time, then turned it off and sat in the dark, her hands shaking. The next morning, she said little. She moved through the house, quietly made breakfast for the kids, and smiled for them as best she could. But Maximus noticed her distance. She sat on the porch steps that afternoon, her eyes distant, her shoulders slumped in a way that reminded him too much of someone who had already lost. He came out with 2 glasses of lemonade and handed one to her. She took it, but didn't drink. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Daisy said softly, "Maybe I shouldn't fight this." Maximus didn't respond immediately. He waited. She glanced sideways, and when she saw his expression hadn't changed, she continued, "He's got everything. Lawyers, money, friends in the system. And now the whole town probably thinks I'm some kind of criminal. Maybe Connor and Maple would be better off with someone who doesn't bring this kind of trouble around." Maximus set his glass down and turned toward her. "Don't say that. Don't let him win without a fight. But what if the fight hurts them more?" Daisy said, her voice cracking. "They're just kids. They don't deserve to be caught in the middle of this." Maximus looked out toward the garden, the late summer blooms swaying in the breeze. His voice was quieter now, but firm. "When my wife Anna and I took in her niece years ago, people talked. They said it was a mistake, said we weren't ready, that we were too old, too soft. That little girl turned out to be the light of our lives. The voices outside don't matter. It's the ones you go to sleep with and wake up for. And those 2 in that room, they know who their mother is. No article or lawyer can change that." Daisy didn't say anything right away. Her fingers tightened around the glass in her hand. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the yard. "If you're still willing to stand beside me," she said. "Finally. Then I'll keep going." Maximus nodded once. Every step. That night, Linda called with a question that shifted the tone of the case. "Did Leo ever record your conversations? Threaten you on video over text?" Daisy paused, then said, "Yes. He used to record arguments to throw back in my face. He kept everything. He said it was for protection, but I knew it was to control me." "Do you know where those recordings are?" Linda asked. Daisy thought hard. "He had a locked drawer in his office, always kept it shut, said it was private." Maximus, listening nearby, leaned in. "Who else would know what's inside?" Daisy hesitated. "His assistant, Enzo. He worked for Leo for years. He saw everything, but he always looked away. I never knew where Enzo stood." Linda's voice was sharp. "Then he's our next move." Maximus nodded slowly. "Tell me where to find him." The article came out late on a Wednesday. Daisy saw it by accident scrolling through her phone after putting the kids to bed. Her thumb stopped mid-swipe when she recognized an old photo of herself, one taken during her time in a women's shelter, her face tired and eyes hollow. The headline read, "Can this woman be trusted with her children?" It wasn't published by any major outlet, just a local blog with ties to conservative circles in Oak Ridge, but it was being shared rapidly. She clicked it already, feeling her stomach tighten. The piece was a patchwork of half-truths and outright lies, misquoted statements, references to sealed court records, and insinuations that she was unstable and manipulative. Leo wasn't named, but his fingerprints were all over it. As she read through the hateful comments, Daisy felt her skin crawl. Strangers called her unfit, selfish, a danger to her children. They dissected her past like it was public property. Later that night, she found Connor in the living room, staring at his tablet. He looked up at her, unsure if he should speak. She sat down beside him. "You okay?" He hesitated. "A kid from my old school sent me that article. They said you might lose us, that maybe we'll live with someone else soon. Is that true?" Daisy didn't know how to answer at first. Her throat tightened. "No," she said firmly but gently. "You're not going anywhere. Not without me. Not ever." She held him for a long time after that, her hands wrapped tightly around his small shoulders, her heart pounding with a mix of rage and shame she didn't know how to process. The next morning, Daisy moved through the house like a machine. She got the kids ready, made breakfast, washed dishes, and folded laundry without speaking much. Maximus noticed, of course. Her silence wasn't the stillness of peace. It was the quiet before a storm. He waited until the kids were in the backyard before approaching her in the kitchen. She was wiping down the counter again and again, though it was already clean. He placed a hand on her wrist gently. "Daisy, look at me." She stopped. Her eyes met his. There was no collapse, no tears, just a steady, simmering coldness. "They went after my kids," she said. "They're trying to turn the world against me and make my son afraid of losing me. That's not just cruel, it's calculated." Maximus nodded. "Leo wants you off balance. He wants you to spiral, because if you fall apart, he wins." Daisy wiped her hands on a dish towel and looked out the window. "I'm not falling apart, not this time." That afternoon, Maximus called Linda and asked her to meet them at her office. They sat down across from her, and she slid over a folder. "We might have something," she said. "If Leo has been recording Daisy over the years and we can get those files, we may be able to use them to demonstrate a pattern of control. The court doesn't look kindly on manipulation, especially when children are involved. Do either of you know who might have access to that kind of material?" Daisy took a breath. "Enzo." He was Leo's assistant, always quiet, always in the background, but he handled everything, scheduling legal filings, documents. If anyone knows what Leo kept and where, it would be him. Linda nodded. "Then we need to talk to him. Carefully. We can't subpoena unless we know what he has, and we can't know what he has unless he talks." Maximus didn't wait. The next morning, he drove alone to a small cafe near the courthouse, where Enzo was known to get his coffee before work. Maximus recognized him instantly, a thin man in his late 30s, wearing a fitted gray coat and glasses that never quite sat straight. Enzo looked startled when Maximus approached, but he didn't run. They sat at a corner table by the window. Maximus didn't start with threats or pleas. He started with facts. "You worked for Leo Henderson. You know how he treats people. You know what he's capable of. You saw how he spoke to his wife when no one else was around." Enzo stirred his coffee, his movements rigid. "You don't know what you're asking me to do. If he finds out I helped you, I'm done. Professionally, personally. I've seen what he does to people who cross him." Maximus leaned forward, calm but unflinching. "And what about Daisy? About her kids? Have you seen what he's already done to them? What he's still trying to do? He uses fear like it's currency, Enzo. He counts on people being too afraid to stand up. That's why he wins. Because too many people like you look the other way." Enzo shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His eyes dropped. "I didn't know how bad it was. I stayed out of it. I told myself it wasn't my place." Maximus let a beat of silence stretch between them, then said, "It became your place the moment you watched a woman be broken down in silence. You were the only other person in the room, and you chose to disappear. But now you have a chance to do something that matters. You don't have to take him down. Just help protect a mother and her children from more damage. That's not betrayal. That's redemption." Enzo stared at him, visibly shaken. His breath hitched. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. He kept recordings, some video, some audio. Most were on a secure drive in his home office. I wasn't allowed to touch it, but I saw him label them. Arguments, calls, even private moments. I don't know what all of it was for, but I know it wasn't good. Maximus watched him carefully. "Do you have access to any of it copies backups?" Enzo hesitated again, visibly torn. Then in a low voice he said, "I took some of the files once. For leverage. I didn't know if I'd ever need them. I hid them. I still have them. But if Leo finds out, he'll ruin me." Maximus met his eyes. If Leo wins, Daisy loses her kids. 2 innocent children are forced back under his shadow. You don't want that on your conscience. Enzo looked like he might cry. He nodded again, this time with more certainty. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a flash drive. He placed it on the table, looked around cautiously, and slid it across. "Don't ever tell him where you got it, and don't come back." That night in Linda's office, they opened the files. The first audio clip was of a phone call. Leo's voice was unmistakable. "If she doesn't come back by the end of the week, I'll bury her in court. I don't care if it takes a year. I'll win. That's what matters." Another clip featured Leo mocking Daisy during an argument, accusing her of being paranoid, while he calmly detailed how he'd make sure she had nothing left. There were timestamps, dates, context. Daisy listened to the first 2 clips in silence, her jaw clenched, hands gripping the armrest of the chair. Linda paused the playback. "This is powerful," she said. "This shows intent, a pattern of control. Judges take this seriously. With the right framing, it can change everything." Maximus turned to Daisy. "You okay?" She nodded slowly. "I'm not crying," she said. "I'm remembering. Every time he said no one would believe me. Every time I felt crazy for trying to speak up. Now people can hear for themselves." She stood up steadier now. "We're going to use this. Every second. Every word." Linda smiled for the first time that week. "Then let's build the case. We file a motion in the morning. From here on out, we fight on record." For the first time since the fight began, Daisy walked out of that office without dread following her. She didn't feel small. She didn't feel like a mother clinging to her children. She felt like a woman standing in the center of her own truth finally heard. And she wasn't done yet. The flash drive had barely cooled from the heat of Maximus's pocket when Linda filed the motion. It was fast, precise, and damning. The audio files, each marked by time and context, were attached to an emergency petition arguing Leo's ongoing pattern of psychological abuse. Linda knew the judge would take it seriously. Family court frowned upon manipulation, especially when children were involved. Daisy sat beside her, quiet but alert, watching every page of the filing pass from the printer into the folder like it carried the weight of her future. This time, she didn't need reassurance. She was focused. When Linda passed her the final copy for review, Daisy said simply, "Let's make sure this lands where it needs to." Hours later, the document was on the judge's desk. That evening, Maximus and Daisy sat at the kitchen table while the kids colored in the living room. The overhead light hummed faintly, and outside the wind stirred the leaves. Maximus poured a cup of coffee and slid one across to Daisy. "You did good today," he said. "Whatever happens now, we're not in the dark anymore." Daisy nodded. For the first time, he's the one who doesn't know what comes next. They didn't have to wait long. The next morning, Linda called. Her voice was brisk, but not panicked. "Leo knows." He responded with a formal counter-motion, but the language is different, less aggressive. He's backing off the emergency custody push for now. That means he's nervous. That same afternoon, a black SUV parked across the street from Maximus's home and didn't move for 45 minutes. Connor noticed first. "Mom, why is that car just sitting there?" Daisy's body stiffened as she came to the window. She didn't recognize the vehicle, but her gut tightened. Maximus stepped outside to take the trash bins to the curb, giving the SUV a long look. It pulled away slowly, tires crunching gravel. That night, Maximus checked the cameras he'd installed weeks ago and backed up the footage. "He's poking the fence," he said to Daisy, "trying to see if we'll panic." Daisy didn't flinch. "Let him watch. We're not running anymore." 2 days later, Maximus received a call from an unfamiliar number. It was Enzo. His voice was tight-strained. "He knows," Enzo said. "I don't know how, but he knows it was me. I was let go this morning. No severance, no warning, just gone." Maximus listened silently. "Are you safe?" Enzo gave a dry laugh, as safe as someone can be when their whole career just evaporated. "Someone was parked outside my apartment last night. I'm not stupid enough to confront them, but I don't scare easy either. I'd do it again." Maximus paused, then said firmly, "You did what was right, and if anything else happens, you call me. Don't disappear." Later that evening, Daisy found Maximus standing alone on the back porch, his arms crossed as he watched the horizon dim. She stepped up beside him, pulling her sweater tight. "He's lashing out," she said. Maximus nodded, because he knows he's cornered. Men like him, they don't panic when they lose money or status. They panic when they lose control. Daisy was quiet for a moment, then said, "I feel bad for Enzo. He lost everything for helping me." Maximus looked at her, his voice gentle but resolute. "No, he made a choice, just like we did. The cost of truth is always high, but it's the only currency that buys real change. Don't carry guilt that isn't yours." She took a breath, nodded, then "Let's keep going. Let's not let this end with damage. Let it end with victory." The next day, Linda arranged a session with a child welfare consultant, someone experienced in assessing household stability for custody hearings. It wasn't mandatory, but Linda believed it would strengthen Daisy's position. The consultant arrived in the afternoon, a woman in her 50s with clear eyes and a soft but firm demeanor. She observed the home, watched the children interact, asked Daisy questions about their routines, schooling, emotional health. Afterward, the consultant pulled Linda aside. "These children are calm, grounded, expressive. That doesn't happen in a high-conflict environment. It happens in safety. I'll write the report accordingly." When she left, Daisy sat down on the couch watching Connor and Maple play on the rug with a box of Legos. She spoke without looking up. This is what he wants to tear apart. These moments, their laughter, their trust. Maximus sat beside her. "And this is what we'll protect. Every brick, every smile, no matter the cost." That night before bed, Daisy pulled out a notebook and began writing by hand. Not a statement for court, not a legal record, just words. Her truth. Her voice on paper, not to justify herself, but to remember why she started, and to remind herself when the courtroom doors opened what exactly she was standing for. And just like that, the war for her children shifted again. No longer a battle of defense. Now, finally, an offensive worth taking. The courthouse loomed large that morning, not because of its architecture, which was unremarkable, but because of what it represented to Daisy. It wasn't just a building, it was a final battleground, a place where words would be weighed, where past and present would collide, and where the outcome could redefine everything she had rebuilt piece by piece. Maximus drove them in silence, the air inside the car thick with a calm tension. Daisy sat in the passenger seat, hands resting on her lap fingers, slightly curled nails clean but short from weeks of nervous biting. She didn't shake. She didn't sweat. She was calm, but it wasn't peace. It was readiness. When they arrived, Linda was already waiting by the courthouse steps, her briefcase in one hand, a set of documents under the other arm. She gave a slight nod, her expression unreadable but present. Connor and Maple weren't with them. They were staying with Maximus's longtime friend Margaret for the day, safe and out of sight. Daisy had kissed them both before leaving, kneeling to their eye level, her voice steady. "Mommy has to tell the truth today, and the truth is strong, so I need to be strong too." Inside the courtroom was modest but formal. Oak-paneled walls, rows of worn benches, the judge's seat elevated behind a plain wooden desk. Daisy sat beside Linda at the plaintiff's table. Across the room, Leo entered with 2 attorneys and an air of quiet confidence. His suit was flawless, his hair combed back. He smiled politely to the clerk, then took his seat without glancing once in Daisy's direction. The session began with procedural formalities, the clerk calling the case the judge, a woman in her late 60s, named Judge Reynolds, entering with a measured step and a clear gaze. She read over the initial summaries, then signaled for Leo's side to begin. His lead attorney stood and spoke with practiced ease. They painted Leo as a stable, responsible father who had endured emotional unpredictability from Daisy. They referenced the article from months ago, questioned her history with mental health, and implied she was using the children to manipulate Leo emotionally. Then came a subtle pivot that stung deeper than any direct accusation. The attorney, a man in his 50s with a polished tone, let his voice drop just slightly as he mentioned Daisy's background and upbringing. He spoke about Leo's family roots in the city, their standing, and his connections with child services and community organizations. "Mr. Henderson has deep ties in this county. He has a consistent record of employment, no criminal history, and an extended family that reflects long-standing values. Miss Murphy, by contrast, comes from less structured circumstances. We must ask Your Honor whether the instability we've seen is not only circumstantial, but perhaps cultural." There was no direct slur, no name called, but Daisy felt it instantly. It was coded, practiced, and sharp. Her hand twitched on the table. She saw the flicker in Linda's jaw, but the attorney kept moving as if he hadn't said anything questionable at all. Leo stood next. His voice, as always, was smooth. "Your Honor, I have no interest in punishing Daisy. I just want what's best for my children. That means stability. That means a safe, predictable environment where they can thrive without tension or fear. I'm not saying she's a bad person. I'm saying that right now, they need more than she can give." Linda remained still, letting him finish. She waited until the courtroom was quiet, until even the air seemed to pause. Then she rose. "Your Honor, if I may present rebuttal evidence." Judge Reynolds nodded. Linda stepped forward, inserted a flash drive into the courtroom system, and tapped the laptop. Audio filled the room. Leo's voice echoed off the walls, low but unmistakable. "If she doesn't crawl back, I'll bury her with the courts. You watch. I don't care what it takes. She doesn't get to leave and keep them." There was a pause. Then another clip. Leo again, more aggressive this time. "She thinks someone will believe her. Let her cry. That's what they do. Then they beg. She'll come around. They always do." A ripple moved through the courtroom. The judge held up a hand, signaling the clerk to pause the playback. She leaned forward slightly. "Is there more of this?" "There is," Linda said, "all time-stamped, dated, and verified." There is a clear, consistent pattern of coercive behavior, including threats, emotional intimidation, and strategic defamation. This is not a custody dispute based on parental disagreement. This is control. Leo's attorneys objected. One stood quickly. Your Honor, this evidence was obtained through questionable means. It invades privacy. Overruled, Judge Reynolds said without hesitation. This court is tasked with evaluating not just fitness but intent. This speaks directly to that. Continue. Linda turned to Daisy, her voice gentler now. Miss Murphy, would you like to address the court briefly? Daisy stood slowly. Her knees didn't buckle. Her voice, when it came, was even, not rehearsed, just real. I didn't want this to be a war. I left to survive, not to punish. I didn't come here to win. I came to be heard. Because silence lets cycles keep spinning, and I didn't want my children to learn that love comes with fear. I'm not perfect, but I'm present. And every night they go to sleep knowing that they're safe, that someone hears them, holds them, helps them grow. That's what being a parent is. Not the money you spend, not the house you live in, but the trust you earn. She looked directly at the judge, not Leo. They trust me, and I won't betray that. I know there are people in this room who may look at me and see someone less polished, less connected, but I am not less worthy, and my children are not less deserving of safety because their mother happens to be a woman of color who chose to leave. She sat back down. Linda didn't add anything. She knew there was nothing left to say that wouldn't dilute what had just been delivered. Judge Reynolds looked at both parties, her face composed but focused. This court will take time to deliberate and consider all presented evidence. A ruling will be issued within the next few days. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck once. The room exhaled. As they exited the courtroom, Leo walked ahead without a word, his attorneys flanking him tightly. His jaw was tight. His smile was gone. Daisy walked out beside Maximus, her posture tall, her expression unreadable but steady. Outside, the air was cool. The sky was overcast, but her lungs filled deeply for the first time in months. They didn't speak right away. Then Maximus said quietly, "You were everything they needed to hear, and nothing he expected." Daisy looked ahead. Her voice was low but resolute. "Now we wait. But whatever comes next, I said what mattered, and they can't take that back." And in that moment, as they stepped off the courthouse steps, it wasn't about fear or doubt anymore. It was about truth, spoken heard and finally undeniable. The courthouse hallway was quieter than it had been all week. The tension that once buzzed through the floors had settled into something more subdued, a kind of heavy anticipation that sat deep in the chest. Daisy stood near the tall windows, her arms crossed lightly in front of her. She had worn navy again, no patterns, nothing flashy, and kept her hair back the way Linda suggested. Clean, centered, unobstructed. Maximus was seated just a few feet away, flipping slowly through a folder of notes, not reading so much as giving his hands something to do. The hearing had ended days ago, but this morning the judge would return with a ruling, and that ruling would redraw the lines of her family. Daisy hadn't slept the night before. She tried for the children for her own sanity, but each time her eyes closed, her mind played out a dozen different outcomes, some with anger, some with grief, but none with certainty. She had done what she could. She had spoken her truth without apology. Now it was out of her hands. Linda arrived just after 8:30, her posture as upright as ever, but her face softer than usual. "They're calling us in within 15 minutes, she said, eyes moving from Maximus to Daisy. "You ready?" Daisy nodded once. "As I'll ever be." In the courtroom, the seats were mostly empty, a few clerks. A local reporter who had sat silently through the entire trial. Leo was there, of course, flanked by his attorneys again. He didn't look at Daisy when she entered. He just adjusted his cufflinks and sat very still. Judge Reynolds entered without introduction. She moved with measured steps, placed her notes before her, and looked up once to scan the room. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but not cold. After reviewing all arguments, written documentation, submitted recordings, and verbal testimony, this court has reached a decision in the matter of custody regarding Connor and Maple Henderson. The pause between those last words and the next was no more than a breath, but in Daisy's body it echoed like thunder. It is the court's position that Miss Murphy has demonstrated not only the capacity to care for her children, but the emotional clarity, daily presence, and personal accountability necessary to raise them in an environment built on stability, empathy, and protection. The court recognizes Mr. Henderson's financial contributions and community standing. However, it also finds credible and concerning the recordings indicating coercion, verbal abuse, and an intentional strategy of psychological control. Leo's shoulders stiffened. The judge continued. Therefore, full physical and legal custody is awarded to Miss Murphy. Mr. Henderson is to have no unsupervised visitation at this time. Additionally, the court grants a protective order restricting Mr. Henderson from any unsanctioned contact, direct or indirect, with Miss Murphy or the children for a minimum of 1 year subject to review. For a few seconds, the room was absolutely silent. Daisy's ears rang. She stared at the judge's mouth slightly parted until Linda touched her hand beneath the table, a quiet signal that yes, she had heard correctly. Leo stood abruptly, his chair screeching backward. His lawyer grabbed his sleeve, whispered something, but Leo didn't respond. His face was tight, unreadable. For a moment, Daisy thought he might say something, a final threat, a bitter warning, but he didn't. He turned and left without looking back. The gavel fell. The ruling was entered. Outside the courthouse, the clouds that had loomed all morning began to break. A faint line of light slipped through, brushing the sidewalk where Daisy stood motionless. Maximus stood next to her, silent. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. She turned slowly, eyes meeting his, and for the first time in weeks, her mouth curled into something close to a smile. "It's done," she said. He nodded. "It's done." They walked to the car slowly. There was no rush. Every step felt deliberate, as if her body had to relearn movement without the constant weight of anxiety. When they pulled into the driveway of Maximus's house an hour later, the front door opened before they could even knock. Connor ran out first, followed closely by Maple. Their faces lit up when they saw her. "Mommy!" Connor yelled. She crouched to the ground as they rushed, her arms thrown around her neck. Her throat tightened as she held them both, one hand on each back, pulling them as close as she could without crushing them. "We're staying?" Maple asked, eyes wide. Daisy pulled back slightly, tears in her eyes now, but they didn't fall. "We're home, baby girl. We're home for good." That evening, after the kids were asleep, Daisy sat on the back porch with Maximus. The garden, which had once been a quiet monument to Anna, now hummed with life again. The wind moved gently through the flowers. The porch light flickered, and for the first time there was nothing looming in the distance. Daisy held her tea mug in both hands. "I keep thinking about the way he looked at me in that courtroom, like I was a stranger, like he couldn't believe I spoke back." Maximus looked out toward the yard. He never expected to lose control. That was his whole structure. You changed that. You made a different future. She nodded, then looked at him. "And I didn't do it alone. I had help. I had you." Maximus smiled slightly. "You had strength. I just stood beside it." The stars were coming out slow and scattered. Daisy took a deep breath, and for once, it went all the way down. Tomorrow, there would still be things to figure out. A job, school logistics, the ordinary complexities of single motherhood. But tonight there was no fear knocking at her door. No lawyer waiting to pounce. No man trying to claim what wasn't his. Tonight, there was only freedom. The first morning after the verdict felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. There was no alarm in Daisy's chest as she opened her eyes. No immediate spike of adrenaline. Just the soft sound of birds outside and the creak of the floorboards as Maple tiptoed past the bedroom door. Daisy sat up slowly, letting her feet find the wooden floor, then paused to listen to the quiet. It was not the same kind of silence that had once followed fear. This silence felt earned, like space cleared for something new. Downstairs, Connor was already at the kitchen table, deeply focused on a puzzle he'd half finished the night before. Maximus was by the stove, stirring oatmeal, humming something low and familiar. Maple was curled in a blanket on the couch, her favorite stuffed elephant resting on her lap. "Morning," Daisy said softly as she walked into the room. Connor looked up. "Morning, Mom. We're making apple cinnamon today." Maximus gave her a glance over his shoulder, his smile subtle but warm. "Special request from the youngest board member of this house." She moved to the sink to wash her hands, then turned and leaned against the counter watching them. Something inside her wanted to cry, but not out of sadness. Out of the weight lifting the permission to breathe again. These small, quiet moments had always been what she feared losing most, and now they were hers undisturbed. Later that week, Daisy walked into a small flower shop on the edge of town. It had a worn teal awning and a bell that jingled with charm when the door opened. The owner, a woman in her early 60s named Eloise, had a reputation for hiring women who needed a second chance. Linda had connected them. Daisy wore a pressed shirt and soft blue jeans. She didn't try to dress up too much. She wanted to be honest. When Eloise asked her to talk about her experience, Daisy spoke from the heart. "I don't have a long resume," she said, "but I know what it means to care for something delicate, to bring life back to something that looks like it's gone. That's what I did every day to survive, and it's what I want to keep doing." Eloise looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "You start Monday." When Daisy stepped outside, the sun had shifted slightly, touching her shoulders. It felt like a quiet yes from the universe. She pulled out her phone and texted Maximus, "Got it. Start next week. Thank you." The following days slipped into rhythm. Maple started at a new preschool nearby. Connor returned to public school, and Daisy walked him to the bus every morning. The first day, he held her hand a little tighter, but when the bus arrived, he smiled big and ran up the steps. She waited until it turned the corner before exhaling. Maximus began spending more time in the garden with Maple, teaching her the names of plants, showing her how to press her finger gently into the soil to test moisture. Daisy often found them outside in the evenings, heads bent over small green things, whispering like they were holding secrets between them. One afternoon, Maximus and Daisy were replanting a row of daisies along the front fence. The irony of the flower's name didn't go unnoticed, but neither of them commented on it. The breeze was soft, the light long. Maximus sat back on his heels and looked at her. "You know," he said, "when Anna passed, I thought the house had finished speaking, like its voice went with her, but lately it's been loud again." Daisy set down the trowel, brushing dirt from her hands. "Loud how?" "Not noisy, just alive. The floorboards creak differently. The light shifts in the hallway at night. The laughter doesn't echo, it fills. You and the kids. You gave it breath again." Her eyes softened, and she looked away briefly, blinking hard. "We needed a place to be heard, and you gave it to us." He nodded. "So we keep building, yeah?" She smiled. "Yeah, we keep building." That weekend, someone knocked at the front door just after breakfast. Maximus opened it and paused, his smile forming before a word left his mouth. "Barbara," he said, voice touched with something deeper than surprise. "You made it." Standing there was a young woman in her 20s with a short braid over her shoulder, a small backpack over one arm, and eyes that looked a lot like Anna's. Barbara had grown up under this roof years ago, Anna's niece, who became their ward after a family loss. She had gone on to study out of state and hadn't been back in some time. But today she returned. Barbara stepped inside, looked around slowly, and then wrapped her arms around Maximus. "You look good," she said into his shoulder. "Same old boots." He chuckled. "Same old garden, too." Come in, come in." Daisy stood at the edge of the hallway watching. Maximus motioned to her. "Barbara, this is Daisy, and those two wild things playing upstairs, that's Connor and Maple." Barbara stepped forward and extended a hand. "I heard all of it. I've been following from a distance. You're braver than I ever was." Daisy shook her hand and gave a half smile. "You grew up here. That already makes you strong." They shared tea that afternoon, laughter rolling slowly into the space. Barbara played with Maple on the floor while Connor showed her his sketch pad. By sunset, it already felt like she had always been there. On Saturday, the five of them went to the community park. It was simple, a few swings, a small slide-shaded benches, but it was enough. Maple ran ahead to the play structure Connor followed, and Daisy, Maximus, and Barbara sat with coffee and paper cups watching. A few parents recognized Daisy, and while there were still whispers, they were different now. Not judgment, curiosity, even respect. That night, Maple climbed into Daisy's lap on the porch and curled against her chest. "Mommy," she said, voice small, "is Leo gone forever?" Daisy didn't answer right away. She stroked her daughter's hair and looked out at the stars. "He's not part of our life anymore," she said, "and we're safe now. That's what matters." Maple nodded, slowly satisfied. "Okay, I like safe." "Me too, baby. Me too." Inside, Connor was sketching with colored pencils Maximus had bought him. Barbara was curled on the couch reading. The living room smelled faintly of vanilla from the candle Daisy always lit before bedtime. And outside the garden Maximus once tended alone now bloomed with the help of small hands and new laughter. There would be more chapters, more questions, more healing. But this chapter began with something Daisy never expected to feel again. Peace. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If this story of resilience, of elderly kindness, and quiet courage touched something in you, let us know in the comments. Your words matter more than you think. We believe in sharing inspiring elderly stories and true life transformations that remind us how powerful a simple act of compassion can be. Don't forget to subscribe, because in the next episode, you'll witness another chapter of strength healing and unexpected generosity that might just change the way you see the world.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.